My name is Jessica Mitchell, 29 years old. And the moment that changed everything happened at my wedding reception when my own father stood up in front of 300 of Boston's elite and delivered the cruelest speech I'd ever heard. He looked directly at me, his daughter is the bride, and said, "Jessica is pathetic. Samantha is the pride of this family. Jessica chose a waiter, what a disgrace." The ballroom at the Fairmont Copley Plaza went dead silent. I felt like I was drowning in my own wedding dress, suffocating under the weight of a lifetime of being second best. But then my husband Michael squeezed my hand and whispered something that made my heart race. It's time they knew the truth. What happened next didn't just shock my father, it left him speechless, desperately trying to shake hands with a man he had just publicly humiliated. I'm going to tell you exactly how karma came for my toxic family. But first, I need you to understand something. This wasn't just about one terrible speech. This was the culmination of 29 years of being told I wasn't enough, of watching my sister get everything while I got nothing, of being called a dreamer like it was a disease. Let me know where you're watching from in the comments, and please hit that like button, because this story will restore your faith that sometimes the overlooked ones get the last laugh. But to understand how sweet that victory was, you need to know where it all began. I grew up in Beacon Hill, where the streets looked like postcards. Cobblestones polished by centuries of footsteps, townhouses lined in neat rows with black shutters and glossy brass knockers. On the outside, it seemed like a perfect neighborhood, filled with people who knew the right clubs to join, the right charities to donate to, the right words to say in front of the right audience. Inside our house, though, it was a different story. The Mitchells were a family people envied from afar, but behind the polished doors, love was conditional, measured by success and appearances. My father, Daniel Mitchell, was the kind of man whose presence filled every room even when he stayed, silent. As the head of Mitchell Capital, he had built a reputation in Boston as a shrewd, ruthless CEO, someone who could crush a deal with a single glance. At home, he carried the same authority. His voice didn't rise often, but when it did, it left you cold. My mother, Margaret, seemed softer, but her softness was a performance. She smiled for society photographs were pearls like armor and orchestrated our lives so that nothing ever tainted the Mitchell name. And then there was Samantha, my younger sister by 2 years, but she seemed to exist in a different league. Samantha had the kind of golden beauty that made people stop mid-sentence, hair that always caught the light eyes sharp enough to slice. She knew how to walk into a room and take it over. Our parents adored her, praised her ambition, and celebrated her charm. She was the child they showed off. I was the one they tolerated. For years, I told myself I didn't care. I buried myself in books writing essays late into the night, finding joy in stories where the overlooked girl proved her worth. But the cracks always showed, and nowhere were they clearer than on the night of my 16th birthday. It was supposed to be a small gathering, though in my family, even small meant caterers, crystal glasses, and a guest list my mother had curated as carefully as a gala. I remember standing in the dining room lace dress, itching at my collarbone, watching the door for someone who mattered to me more than anyone on that list. Michael Scott wasn't from Beacon Hill. He didn't come from money or legacy. He worked part-time at the library downtown, stacking books after school, saving for college. He was quiet but thoughtful, the kind of boy who asked what I was reading and actually wanted to hear the answer. When he walked in that night, I felt like the room shifted. He held a neatly wrapped package under his arm, his hair sticking up as if he'd rushed there. He smiled at me, that nervous half-smile that made my stomach flip. He handed me the gift, and when I tore the paper, I found a hardcover novel, my favorite author, with pages lined in his handwriting. He had annotated it for me, little notes in the margins, small arrows pointing to passages with comments about why they reminded him of me. Tucked inside was a card with simple words, telling me he admired my kindness and the way I saw the world. My throat tightened. It wasn't diamonds or designer purses, but it was thoughtful, genuine. And it was mine. I barely managed to whisper, "Thank you," before laughter sliced through the moment. Samantha. She was leaning against the table, glass of champagne in hand, though she was only 14. Her voice carried sharp and mocking. "Is that it? A book? That's all he could manage?" The laughter from her lips wasn't kind, it was cruel, meant to wound. She turned to the guests, her smile widening. "My sister really does have the lowest standards. Can you imagine a library boy with a secondhand book?" The room froze. All eyes turned toward my father, waiting for him to correct her. He didn't. Daniel adjusted his cufflinks expression unreadable and sipped his drink. His silence was permission. Michael's face burned red, his hands fumbling at his sides. He stammered something about needing to leave, then turned and disappeared through the door. I wanted to chase him to tell him that the gift was perfect, that he was enough, but my legs wouldn't move. My cheeks burned as everyone looked away, awkwardly pretending not to notice. Samantha lifted her glass again, satisfied. My mother gave a weak laugh, trying to smooth over the tension, but the damage was done. Later that night, I sat on my bed with the book in my lap. I traced the handwriting in the margins, words blurred by my tears. Michael didn't answer my texts, and by Monday, he avoided me at school. By the end of the week, he stopped coming to the library when I was there. Samantha had taken something fragile and beautiful and crushed it, and no one had stopped her. That night, something shifted in me. I realized that in my house, hierarchy wasn't subtle. It was the law. Samantha's worth was celebrated. Mine was diminished if not ignored. Our mantle filled with her achievements, debate trophies, perfect report cards, glossy photos of summer internships. My accomplishments were met with polite nods, quickly redirected back to her. I remember when I won a statewide essay competition, an honor that made me glow with pride. I brought the certificate home, hoping maybe this time my father would look at me with approval. He glanced at it once and said, "Writing is nice, but it won't pay the bills." Then he asked Samantha about her economics class, as if my moment had already expired. But it was a night a year later that carved the wound deepest. I had made the honor roll again, one of the few things that still gave me confidence. I told my father at dinner, hoping for the smallest acknowledgement. He looked at me eyes flat and said, "Samantha is the pride of this family. You, Jasmine, you're just a dreamer." The words landed like stones. Dreamer. As if it were an insult, as if caring about people and ideas was foolish. I forced a smile, pretending it didn't sting. But later, I buried my face in the pillow, muffling the sobs that shook my chest. Dreamer. The word followed me for years, whispered in the back of my mind whenever I tried to be proud of myself. But as much as it hurt, it also planted something in me, a seed of defiance I didn't recognize yet. Every time Samantha smirked, every time my father dismissed me, every time my mother steered conversations away from me, that seed grew. I learned early that I would never be their version of perfect. But I also learned that maybe I didn't want to be. Still at 16, clutching Michael's book and my father's judgment, I felt small, invisible, a shadow in my own home. I told myself that one day I would walk out of Beacon Hill on my own terms. One day I would not need their approval to feel whole. For now, though, I was just the dreamer, staring out the window at the city lights, wishing for a world where love was not measured in status and where someone like me could finally matter. I graduated from Harvard in May of 2015, the sun so bright that the crimson gowns looked like fire in the middle of the yard. Families clapped and cheered, names echoed through the loudspeakers. And I stood there clutching my diploma, smiling for pictures I didn't want to take. My father's arm was heavy around my shoulders as he looked into the camera. But his words were not for me. They were for the future he had already written. "You'll start at Mitchell Capital in July," he murmured, his voice like a contract. "We will groom you for bigger things." My mother's pearl earrings caught the light as she nodded, already picturing me as the daughter who would impress their circle, already planning introductions to partners and executives. Samantha, still a junior at Yale at the time, grinned like she was in on the joke. She told a family friend that her big sister would finally stop daydreaming and step into the real world. They all thought they knew me. What none of them saw was that during those years in Cambridge, my heart belonged to classrooms in Dorchester, not boardrooms downtown. I had volunteered in after-school programs, tutoring kids who had been told too many times that they were behind, sitting with children who carried the weight of adult problems in their tiny frames. I saw their eyes light up when they solved a math problem, their pride when they read a page aloud without stumbling. That feeling gave me more joy than any corporate ladder ever could. So when I told my family that I had accepted a teaching position at Boston Public Elementary, their reactions landed like knives. My father's fork froze in midair. He stared at me as if I had confessed to a crime. "You are throwing away everything we gave you. Do you have any idea how this looks? You are embarrassing this family." My mother pressed her napkin to her lips, as though the word teacher tasted sour. "Jasmine, darling, people will laugh." A Harvard graduate choosing chalkboards and lesson plans. What will they say? At the club? Samantha leaned back in her chair, a smirk painted across her face. "Maybe they'll let you join the kids for recess. Just think you can finally master hopscotch." I wanted to shout to slam my hands on the table, but instead I forced myself to speak evenly. "I want a life that feels real." The silence that followed was thick. My father's eyes told me he heard nothing but rebellion. 2 months later, I signed a lease on a one-bedroom apartment near Fields Corner. The walls were faded, the floors scratched, and the heat sputtered like it was dying, but when I turned the key in the lock, I felt something I had never felt inside the Beacon Hill townhouse: freedom. I furnished the space with mismatched chairs from flea markets, thrift store lamps, and stacks of books piled high in corners. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. My father tried one last time. He came to see the apartment, his tailored suit out of place in the narrow stairwell. "I can pay the rent, Jasmine. You don't have to play this little independence game." I shook my head. "I need to do this on my own." He muttered that I would come running back when reality crushed me. I closed the door behind him and leaned against it, shaking but certain. Teaching was harder than I imagined. My first classroom had peeling paint and desks that groaned when the kids leaned on them. Half of my students came hungry. I spent nights grading papers at my kitchen table, coffee keeping me awake while the radiator hissed like it was mocking me. There were moments I wondered if my father had been right, if I had been foolish. But then I would see a child's face light up when they finally understood a concept or watch a shy student raise their hand with confidence, and the doubt would dissolve. Holidays were the real tests. At Thanksgiving, the Mitchell dining room gleamed as always. Polished silver and crystal glasses lined up in perfect order. Samantha launched into stories about her internships with global firms, trips to conferences, mentors who promised her a future in finance. My father nodded with pride. My mother clasped her hands as though Sam had hung the moon. When the spotlight turned to me, my mother asked how many of my students had learned to spell their names. The table laughed softly. I stared at the cranberry sauce, willing myself not to cry. It was at one of those dinners, after the wine had dulled everyone else's edges, that my father finally gave voice to what I had always known he thought. He leaned back in his chair, glass of whiskey in hand, eyes heavy on me. "Jasmine, you are the greatest disappointment of the Mitchell legacy." No one gasped. No one protested. Samantha looked down at her plate as if she didn't want to get caught smiling. My mother poured herself more wine. The words split me open, but they also stitched something back together. For years, I had been living between their expectations and my own small acts of rebellion. That night, I decided there would be no more halfway. If being a disappointment meant refusing to betray who I was, then I would wear it like a badge. I left the townhouse that night in silence, snow falling in soft flakes over the city. My breath clouded in the air as I walked back to my apartment. The lights from Beacon Hill glowed behind me, but I didn't turn around. Inside my little place, the heater rattled to life. My books waited on the shelves, and lesson plans spread across the table like a map of where I belonged. I sat down pen in hand and wrote notes for the next day's class. My father's voice still echoed in my head, disappointment pounding against my ribs, but for the first time, it didn't feel like a curse. It felt like a challenge. If they could not see value in the life I chose, then I would make sure I saw it myself. That night, with the city humming outside my window, I realized I had finally stepped onto my own path. It was not polished. It was not glamorous, but it was mine, and no one could take it from me. The Friday after conferences left me hollowed out. Parents lined up outside my classroom from morning until evening, each one bringing their fears, frustrations, and questions that I could only partly answer. I did my best, but by the time the last mother thanked me and left, my head throbbed. I sat at my desk staring at the messy pile of notes, feeling the weight of everything my students carried on their small shoulders. Their hunger, their struggles, their loneliness. I carried it too, whether I wanted to or not. A colleague, Lily, poked her head in and said we deserved something nice, something beyond the cafeteria leftovers we usually settled for. She suggested Lumiere, the French restaurant downtown that was famous in Boston, the kind of place people saved for anniversaries. I almost said no. My bank account was tight, and Beacon Hill glitter still made me uncomfortable. But I was too tired to fight, and a small part of me wanted to step into a world that reminded me of my family, even if it only deepened the ache. The cab pulled up to the entrance, and my chest tightened. Gold lettering shimmered against the glass doors, chandeliers glowing through tall windows, men in tailored suits laughing in the lobby. It was the kind of place where my father thrived, where my mother paraded, where Samantha would glide in and expect to be noticed. I felt like an intruder in my plain dress and scuffed shoes. We were led to a corner table with a view of the city skyline. I pressed my hands into my lap, pretending to admire the chandeliers so I would not focus on how out of place. I felt that was when he appeared. "Good evening, ladies. My name is Michael, and I'll be your server tonight." I looked up and saw him standing there tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair that curled slightly at the edges. But it was his eyes that stopped me. Brown, steady calm, with a quiet intensity that made me feel as if he was speaking to me alone, even though he addressed the whole table. His voice had no trace of the rehearsed charm I had heard from servers in expensive restaurants. It was natural, grounded, like he had nothing to prove. When he handed me the menu, our fingers brushed. It was a simple touch, accidental, but it jolted me like a spark in dry air. I pulled back quickly, forcing a polite smile, hoping no one noticed the heat creeping up my neck. "Is this your first time here?" he asked. "Yes," I said, my throat dry. "Any recommendations?" Instead of rattling off specials, he began to speak of food like a storyteller. He described the saffron in the bouillabaisse, the cherry reduction with the duck confit, how each ingredient balanced the other. He talked about textures and flavors with a reverence that made me forget I was listening to a waiter. His words painted pictures, his tone almost intimate. And then he looked at me directly. "For you, I would recommend the duck confit. It has a richness balanced by something bright. Something tells me you might appreciate nuance." The table chuckled, my colleagues exchanging glances, but I couldn't find the words to answer. My cheeks burned. I nodded silently as though I had just been handed a secret. The meal passed in a blur. He refilled glasses, offered bread, made subtle jokes that drew laughs without stealing attention. I should have been focused on the food, but every time he returned to our table, I felt the air shift. When we left, I found myself glancing back, watching him disappear behind the curtain into the kitchen. That night, walking home through the cool Boston air, I felt restless. It wasn't just that he was attractive, it was the way he carried himself, the way he seemed untouched by the arrogance of the world he worked in. It unsettled me. The following week, I told myself it was ridiculous, but I returned. I chose a table alone near the window and asked for Michael's section. My voice too quick, my pulse betraying me. When he arrived, that same steady smile crossed his face, and I felt both relieved and exposed. He remembered me. He asked about my week, and when I mentioned a student struggling with reading, he asked follow-up questions, genuine ones, not the polite nodding I had grown used to from people in my family circles. "How did he do on his spelling test?" Michael asked, as if it mattered to him. "Better," I said, blinking at how closely he had listened. "You remembered." "Of course," he replied easily. "Details are important." Our conversation drifted to books to art. He spoke about an exhibition at a warehouse downtown, about brushstrokes and colors with knowledge that surprised me. He talked about a novel he had just finished, and I caught myself leaning forward, drawn in by his quiet passion. It became a pattern. I visited Lumiere more often than my budget allowed, sometimes with Lily, often by myself. Each time, Michael treated me with the same attentive respect, never overstepping, never flirting too openly, but always with an undercurrent I could feel. Every time our hands brushed when he handed me a menu or cleared a plate, something inside me stirred a warmth I hadn't felt in years. There was one night late, when the restaurant had thinned out and I lingered over dessert, reluctant to leave. Michael stopped at my table, resting one hand lightly on the back of a chair. "You look like you needed tonight," he said softly. I swallowed hard, my throat tight. "I did. It's been a long week." He nodded. Teaching is not easy work, but it matters more than most people realize. I stared at him, struck by the way his words cut through me. My father had called it a waste, my mother a mistake, my sister a joke. And here was a man I barely knew telling me it mattered. The contrast made my chest ache. When I reached for the bill, our fingers touched again, lingering just a moment longer than before. His eyes flicked to mine, steady, almost soul-searching, and I felt the world narrow to just the two of us. I walked out into the Boston night with my pulse racing, the city lights blurring. I told myself it was harmless, just a crush, just a distraction. But deep down, I knew it was more. Something had shifted. Michael Evans was not just a waiter who happened to be kind. He had unsettled something buried inside me, something that had been starved for far too long. And as much as I tried to resist it, I knew I would be back. Our first date was nothing like the ones I had grown up watching from a distance at my parents' charity galas. There was no limousine waiting, no private dining room with wine pairings, no choreographed performance meant to impress. Michael invited me to an art exhibition in a converted warehouse in South Boston, a place my parents would have dismissed as beneath them. The building was raw and unpolished, exposed brick walls smelling faintly of sawdust, bare bulbs strung overhead, the hum of conversation carrying through the open space. Yet the moment I stepped inside, I felt more at ease than I ever had in any ballroom in Beacon Hill. He walked beside me without pretense, hands in his pockets, head tilted toward the art as if he belonged in this place. We stopped in front of a massive canvas painted in furious strokes of red and black. I frowned, unsure until Michael leaned closer and said, "Look at the movement. This isn't chaos. It's grief with hope buried under it. See those thin white lines peeking through the red? That's where the artist refused to give up." I turned my head and studied him instead of the canvas. His voice carried certainty, not arrogance. He didn't sound like someone performing knowledge to impress me. He sounded like someone who had lived with loss and recognized it on the wall. You sound like you studied this, I whispered. He smiled, the corner of his mouth lifting just enough. He smiled, the corner of his mouth lifting just enough. I listen. People tell you who they are in more ways than words. The rest of the night, we drifted from painting to sculpture, our conversation weaving through art music books. I couldn't remember the last time I had spoken so freely without worrying what impression I was leaving. With him, it didn't matter. He asked questions because he wanted to know me, not because he wanted ammunition to use later. Afterward, he suggested a walk along the Charles River. The night was cool, the water reflecting the city lights like shattered glass. Couples strolled past, laughter echoing, while I wrapped my coat tighter around myself. Michael walked close enough that our shoulders brushed. "Tell me about your students," he said. I hesitated. Most people didn't want the real answer, but something about his tone made me open up. I told him about Mateo, who sometimes brought his baby sister to school because there was no one else to watch her. I told him about Claire, who refused to read out loud until one day she whispered the first line of a story and then surprised herself by finishing the whole page. Michael listened, his expression serious. Then he said, "What you do is braver than anything I've ever seen." I laughed softly. "Brave, my father calls it pathetic." "Then your father is blind," Michael said firmly, stopping me in my tracks. He looked at me with such clarity it hurt. "I admire you for choosing teaching. It takes courage to give your life to something that won't make you rich, but makes the world better." My chest tightened, my eyes burning before I could stop them. I turned away, quickly embarrassed, but tears spilled anyway. "Hey," he murmured, touching my arm gently. "Don't hide it." I meant every word. I covered my face with my hand, laughing weakly through the tears. "You don't know what that means to me." For years, my family had belittled every choice I made, stripping me of confidence until I began to question myself. To hear someone see worth in me, not because of my last name, but because of what I gave to the world, cracked something open. I couldn't stop the tears, even if I wanted to. From that night on, we became inseparable. Our dates weren't polished affairs. They were messy, simple, and human. He would show up at my apartment after a shift at Lumiere, sleeves rolled, smelling faintly of wine and citrus, and we would cook whatever was in my fridge. Sometimes the pasta burned, sometimes the sauce was thin, but it didn't matter. He laughed when my smoke alarm went off, waving a dish towel dramatically while I tried to fan the air. Other nights we curled on my couch with books and wine music playing softly. He would listen as I ranted about a broken copier at school or a student who made progress after weeks of struggle. He never interrupted, never minimized. He made space for me. That space was something I had never been given at home. Still, there were moments that reminded me he carried secrets. His phone would buzz, and he would step outside to answer, voice low and serious. He always came back with an easy smile, but sometimes his eyes held shadows. When I asked about his family, he gave vague answers about parents who worked in business back in Chicago. He never invited me to his place, joking about terrible roommates. I noticed, but I chose trust. He had given me no reason to doubt his integrity. One Saturday, we packed sandwiches and sprawled on the grass by the river. I leaned against him, shoes off, sun warming my face. He laced his fingers through mine. For a moment, I let myself imagine a future that was mine alone, not dictated by my father's harsh words or Samantha's sharp smiles. But then my phone buzzed. It was a text from my mother, reminding me about an upcoming dinner I had no desire to attend. I tucked it away, my heart sinking. Being with Michael felt like breathing. But I knew the storm waiting if I ever brought him into my family's world. I didn't tell him that day. Instead, I looked at him, the light on his face, the calm in his presence, and thought, this is mine. For once, this is mine. Later that night, after he kissed me goodbye at my apartment door, I stood inside with my back pressed to the wood, my pulse still racing. His words echoed in my mind. "I admire you for choosing teaching. No one had ever said they admired me, not once." And that was how I knew I was falling fast into something I couldn't control. Yet even as joy filled me, a whisper of unease lingered. The private phone calls, the way he brushed off questions about his life. I didn't know what he was hiding, but I told myself it didn't matter. What mattered was how he made me feel. What I couldn't know then was that secrets, no matter how carefully kept, have a way of surfacing. And when his did, they would collide with my family's cruelty in ways I could never have imagined. The night I decided to bring Michael into the Mitchell mansion, Boston felt colder than usual, the kind of chill that seeps into your chest and makes every breath heavier. My hands tightened on the steering wheel as we turned onto the street lined with gas lamps and polished brownstones. The townhouse where I grew up glowed like a fortress. Every window was lit, as if to remind the neighborhood of the Mitchell's grandeur. Michael sat quietly in the passenger seat, his profile calm in the streetlight. "You sure you want me to meet them?" he asked gently, his thumb brushing my knuckles. I forced a laugh that sounded nothing like me. "I've postponed this long enough. If they can't handle it, that's on them." The iron gates opened slowly, the circular driveway already crowded with luxury cars. My little Civic looked like a trespasser among Jaguars and Bentleys. Michael noticed but didn't flinch. He just straightened his shoulders, the quiet confidence that always drew me to him, radiating stronger than ever. My mother opened the door, pearls glowing against her navy silk dress, her smile as polished as the silver in the dining room. "Jasmine, darling." She kissed my cheeks, then turned to Michael with a tilt of her chin. "And you must be Michael. We've heard so very little about you." The words stung more than I wanted to admit. She hadn't even asked me about him in months. The dining room was staged like a magazine spread. Crystal glistened beneath the chandelier. Candles flickered against antique china. My father stood at the head of the table, glass of scotch in hand, his stare cutting through Michael before he'd even sat down. Samantha lounged beside him in a red dress that screamed for attention, scrolling her phone with exaggerated disinterest. "So, Michael," my father began the moment we unfolded our napkins, his voice heavy with command. "Tell me, how do you support my daughter?" Michael didn't shift, didn't stammer. "I'm a server at Lumiere. I have been for 3 years." The silence was brutal. I heard the tick of the grandfather clock in the hall, the faint clink of silverware in the kitchen. My mother's hand froze on her wine glass. My father's eyebrows lifted, his expression tightening into disdain. Samantha's lips curled into a grin that made my skin crawl. "A server," my father repeated slowly, savoring the word like it was filth. "And this is your ambition." Michael's voice stayed even. "I enjoy my work. It allows me to meet people from every walk of life and to learn from them." Samantha leaned forward, eyes glittering. "It's perfect, really. A teacher and a waiter." "Who knew mediocrity could find its match?" my mother sighed, setting her fork down with deliberate grace. "Jasmine, we raised you for more than this." The air burned in my lungs. I tried to swallow it down, but Samantha kept going. "Remember when you won that little essay contest and Dad called it cute? This feels the same, cute but hardly serious." My father gave a thin smile, his scotch swirling in the glass. "Jasmine, you've always been idealistic, but one day you'll realize life requires more than dreams. You could have joined Mitchell Capital, built something meaningful. Instead you chose this." He flicked his gaze at Michael like he was dismissing a stain on his suit. Michael placed his hand lightly over mine, beneath the table, steady and calm, as if reminding me that I didn't have to endure this alone. He said evenly, "Jasmine's work is meaningful. The courage it takes to shape children's futures, to stand by them when no one else does, that's real ambition." My father's jaw tightened. "Real ambition builds empires." "No," Michael said quietly. "Real ambition builds people." The words struck the table like a spark in dry wood. Samantha laughed sharp and cruel. "At least we'll get free appetizers at Lumiere. That's something, right?" My chair scraped the floor as I stood, anger shaking through me. "Enough!" My voice cracked the silence louder than I had ever dared in that room. Michael has more dignity in the way he treats people than all the arrogance and pretense in this house combined. The chandelier light shimmered against stunned faces. My mother gasped, her hand flying to her pearls. Samantha's smile faltered, then hardened into something venomous. My father didn't move, but his eyes burned with a fury I hadn't seen since childhood, the kind that left scars you couldn't see. "We're done here," I said, grabbing Michael's hand. We walked the length of the hall, my heels echoing like gunshots against the marble. The portraits of Mitchell ancestors glared down at me as if I had broken some unspoken covenant. For the first time in my life, I didn't shrink. I pushed open the heavy door and the night air rushed over me cool and sharp, like freedom. Michael pulled me close as we stepped into the dark street. "Their opinion doesn't matter," he murmured. "Only yours does." But as I leaned against him, my body trembling, I couldn't shake the memory of my father's eyes. They had followed me out the door like a warning, a promise that walking away would come with a cost. The house faded behind us, but the storm inside it hadn't ended. It was only gathering strength, waiting for the next chance to strike. A year slipped by before I even realized it. Days of lesson plans and exhausted evenings blurred into weeks, and those weeks folded neatly into months. Through it all, Michael was the constant. He carried a calmness that steadied me after chaotic school days, a quiet strength that shielded me from the lingering venom of my family's words. But time has a way of shifting everything, and on one crisp October afternoon, the ground beneath me shifted more than I could have imagined. He suggested a walk through the Boston Public Garden. The sky was a flawless blue, the air sharp with autumn. Maple leaves lay scattered like gold coins along the paths, crunching beneath our shoes. I should have suspected something from the way his hand lingered tighter in mine or from the nervous rhythm of his breath, but I didn't. Not until he guided me toward the willow. The branches hung low, swaying like curtains, filtering the sunlight into delicate green shadows. Michael stopped, his face uncharacteristically tense. "Jasmine," he said, clearing his throat, "this past year has shown me what real happiness feels like. You saw me for who I am, even when others didn't. You loved me when you thought I had nothing to offer but myself." Then, without another word, he dropped to one knee. My heart slammed against my ribs. He opened a velvet box, and the diamond inside caught the sunlight in sharp, dazzling prisms. It wasn't just large. It was extravagant. The kind of ring I had only ever seen on the manicured hands of women at my mother's country club luncheons. "Will you marry me?" His voice cracked just slightly, but his eyes held steady. Tears blurred my vision. Yes spilled out before I could stop it, before doubt could slither in. He slid the ring onto my finger, and for a moment, all I felt was elation. But then the stone glittered in a way that gnawed at me. The question slipped out soft but trembling. "Michael, how could you afford this?" He smiled, kissing my hand as though that would seal away my doubts. "I've been saving for a long time. Some things are worth every penny." I searched his face looking for cracks, but all I saw was tenderness. I told myself to believe him. I had to. Yet even as I leaned into his embrace, the weight of that diamond pressed into my skin like a reminder of questions I wasn't ready to ask. When I called my parents with the news, their fury was immediate. My mother's voice hissed through the phone, sharp as broken glass. "Marrying a waiter. Jasmine, do you understand what this does to our family's reputation? What will people say my father was still? You're tying yourself to failure. When it collapses, don't come running back to us." I gripped the phone until my knuckles whitened my throat burning. But before I could respond, Samantha's number lit up my screen. Against my better judgment, I answered. Her tone was blunt, dripping with disdain. "Are you pregnant? Because that's the only reason I can imagine you rushing into this." I bit down hard, steadying my voice. "No, Sam, I'm in love." She scoffed. "Love doesn't pay bills. He's after the Mitchell money. Open your eyes. Michael has never asked me for a dime. He doesn't even let me pay for dinner." "Exactly," she snapped. "That's the long game. Men, like that, always know how to wait for the bigger prize." I hung up before my tears betrayed me, but her words clung to me like smoke. Weeks later, Samantha proved she hadn't been speaking idly. She hired a private investigator, something she delivered to me with the smugness of someone convinced she had won. Over coffee, she slid a folder across the table, her nails tapping against it like a drumbeat of judgment. I opened it with dread. His records were clean. A few business courses in Chicago, standard employment at Lumiere, no debts, no skeletons in the closet. Relief should have washed over me, but Sam leaned back with a frown. "Too clean," she muttered. "It looks crafted like someone scrubbed it. Doesn't that seem strange? Or maybe he's just a good man with nothing to hide." I said, though, even as I pushed the folder back, unease flickered in my chest. It wasn't just the ring anymore. It was the late-night phone calls he always took in private. The way he sometimes seemed distracted, lost in thought. The fact that he never invited me to his place, always steering us toward mine or neutral ground. I wanted to ask, but every time I looked at him, every time he smiled at me with that steady warmth, I bit the words back. Then came the night Samantha called me, her voice electric with triumph. I saw him. Saw who I asked, already knowing. Michael. At the Langham lobby. He was with James Reynolds. The name sent a jolt through me. Reynolds was the CEO of New England's largest hotel chain. A man my father had been chasing for years, desperate for a meeting. Samantha's voice was cutting, gleeful. They weren't just passing by. They were laughing, shaking hands like equals. "Explain to me, Jasmine, how your waiter fiancé knows a man like that." I gripped the phone, my pulse pounding. My mind flashed to Michael's calm smile, to the diamond that still glittered accusingly on my hand. I had no answer. That night, I lay awake in my apartment, staring at the ceiling while the city hummed beyond my window. Doubt pressed against my chest until I could barely breathe. Was Michael hiding something from me? Or was this just another trick of Samantha's poison seeping into my thoughts? I turned on my side, clutching the ring, and told myself I would trust him. I had to trust him. Because if I didn't, then everything I had built away from my family's shadow might collapse in an instant. But somewhere deep inside, and when Michael surfaced, they would not only change everything I believed about him, They would bring my family's judgment crashing back into my life in ways I wasn't ready to face. The morning of my wedding arrived with a kind of brightness that felt unreal, as if Boston itself had polished its skies for the occasion. From the bridal suite at the Fairmont Copley, I watched sunlight pour down on Copley Square, gilding the cobblestones and spilling across the trees just beginning to turn. Inside the suite was all satin and roses, polished wood floors gleaming under the chandelier. The air smelled of champagne and lilies. And yet, I couldn't shake the sour twist in my stomach. This was supposed to be the happiest day of my life, but I felt like a guest in my own story. Lily, my maid of honor, darted back and forth pinning my veil, touching up my makeup, humming under her breath to keep the silence from swallowing us. She kept saying everything was perfect, but I could feel her eyes flicking toward me with concern every time my hands trembled. When the wedding planner slipped me the final guest list, I nearly dropped it. Rows of names marched down the page, men and women whose signatures signed billion-dollar deals. Politicians who had appeared on national television, hotel magnates, even 2 actors whose faces grinned from movie posters downtown. My throat tightened. We had only invited a little over 100 people. This list showed nearly 250. I whispered, my voice thin. Where did all these people come from? Lily glanced up from adjusting my veil, her tone too casual. Michael said not to worry. He must know them from work. From work! My mind stumbled over the words. A waiter could meet people, yes, but not fill a ballroom with the elite of Boston and beyond. I nodded as though reassured, but my chest felt heavier. The door burst open, and my mother swept in like a gust of perfume and judgment. Margaret wore navy silk with pearl strands gleaming at her throat. Her hair was lacquered into place, her lipstick flawless. She circled me slowly like she was inspecting a statue before unveiling it. Jasmine, straighten your back. Don't hunch. You'll be in every photograph. It's my wedding, not a press conference, I muttered. Her eyes narrowed. When 2 senators and 3 CEOs are sitting in the front row, it is both. Smile when you walk. People will remember. Before I could reply, my father stepped inside. Daniel filled the room with his presence tuxedo sharp, jaw tighter than I had ever seen. He waited until my mother moved toward the flowers before leaning close, his voice low enough to sting. It's not too late to change your mind. My pulse jumped. You don't know him, I whispered. His stare cut into me. That's exactly the problem. Then Samantha entered without knocking. She didn't so much walk in as glide her scarlet dress clinging to her frame, her lips curved in that familiar smirk that had haunted me since childhood. She leaned against the vanity, her eyes roaming over me with mockery disguised as admiration. Well, at least you look gorgeous. Shame it's going to be wasted. Heat flared under my skin, but Lily shot me a warning glance, silently begging me not to bite. I turned back to the mirror, pressing my lips together until I tasted blood. The photographer arrived, clicking away, each flash exposing the strain etched across my face. I forced smiles, but they felt stiff brittle, like masks that could shatter with one wrong word. Hours slipped by in a blur of noise and nerves. I heard staff outside whispering about another powerful guest arriving, about champagne nearly running out, about the media gathered in the lobby. Through the half-open door, I caught snippets of conversation from strangers in suits, words like merger, investment partnership. They weren't talking about me. They were talking about Michael. When the planner finally announced it was time, I felt my knees wobble. My bouquet of white roses trembled in my hands. The ballroom doors loomed ahead. I peeked through the crack and my breath caught. The room glittered with excess. Crystal chandeliers spilled golden light onto mirrored walls, reflecting towering arrangements of orchids and roses. Gilded chairs stretched in perfect rows, filled with faces I barely recognized, but somehow knew held more power than I could comprehend. They weren't my friends. They weren't family. They were Michael's audience. My father stepped beside me stiffly, offering his arm. His face betrayed nothing, but I could feel the tension in the rigid line of his body. You can still walk away, he muttered, under the swell of the organ. I swallowed hard, forcing my hand into his. The doors swung wide, and the crowd rose to its feet. A hush fell, then whispers rippled through the air like static. My heels clicked against the polished floor, each step echoing like a gavel in a courtroom. I saw the front row as we moved down the aisle. My mother sat tall, her smile plastered on, but her knuckles white against her clutch. Samantha leaned back, lips curved into a smirk, sharp enough to cut, her eyes glinting with the satisfaction of someone who believed the stage was about to collapse beneath me. My father's jaw clenched as he guided me forward, his words hissing again. Mistake. The bouquet shook in my hands. I tried to draw strength from the flowers, from the music swelling around me, but my heart beat so loud I thought the whole room could hear it. And then my eyes found him. Michael stood at the end of the aisle, impossibly composed in his tuxedo. He looked carved out of calm, his smile steady, his eyes locked on mine. For a moment the noise faded, the whispers dimmed, and I felt steadied by the warmth in his gaze. But behind that warmth was something else, relief, anticipation, maybe even triumph. I tried to hold on to the calm, but doubt curled tighter inside me. This wasn't the wedding I had ever imagined. It wasn't intimate, safe, or truly mine. It was a performance, staged under golden lights for strangers whose eyes followed every move like critics in a theater. As I reached the altar, Michael took my trembling hands in his. His fingers were warm, grounding, but they couldn't silence the dread whispering in my chest. I forced a smile at the officiant, but my heart felt like it was unraveling. I knew with a chilling certainty that something was coming, something none of us were prepared for. And as the chandeliers glittered above, as Samantha's smirk gleamed in the front row, and as Michael's eyes held mine with unflinching steadiness, I realized that the true story of this wedding was only just beginning. The ballroom shimmered like a jewel box, chandeliers scattering light over walls lined with gilt mirrors and towering arrangements of roses and orchids. I had never seen so much wealth packed into one room, and yet not a drop of warmth existed in the air. The ceremony had moved along in an almost mechanical rhythm, the officiant's words echoing through the vaulted ceilings, my own vows trembling on my lips. When Michael slipped the ring onto my finger, his hand steady, I tried to cling to that anchor. But beneath the glitter and polite applause, I felt the tension coiling tighter, waiting for its strike. Then the officiant gestured toward the front row, offering my father a chance to speak. My heart clenched. Daniel Mitchell was not a man who liked to perform. He believed respect was best commanded in silence. If he rose now, it was because he could not hold back. And he did. My father pushed himself up with deliberate calm, glass of scotch still in his hand. His tuxedo was immaculate, but his expression was sharp. The same look that once silenced boardrooms and reduced employees to ash. The ballroom fell into a hush so complete I could hear my pulse in my ears. He strode to the microphone, every step loud against the marble. He paused, surveying the crowd, letting the anticipation build. When he finally spoke, his voice was smooth, at first practiced. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being here on what should have been a proud day for the Mitchell family." The words landed like an opening act polite enough to pass. For a fleeting moment, I thought maybe he would surprise me, show a shred of fatherly grace. Then his tone shifted cold and cutting. "But today, I stand before you ashamed." The word cracked through the air. Gasps spread like fire through dry grass. My grip on the bouquet faltered, the stems biting into my palm. Shame crawled up my spine even before he continued, his voice now dripping with venom. "My younger daughter Samantha has always been our pride. She embodies ambition, success, and grace, everything the Mitchell name stands for." He turned then, fixing me with his eyes. "And then there's Jasmine." My name sounded like poison. My knees went weak, my vision shimmering at the edges. He delivered the rest like blows. Jasmine wasted her Harvard education in a rundown public school, surrounding herself with mediocrity. She could have been a force at Mitchell Capital, but instead she chose obscurity. And now, to crown her failures, she drags our family name into disgrace by marrying a waiter. The final word cracked like thunder. The ballroom erupted with murmurs, sharp whispers, darting between tables. Some guests leaned forward, fascinated. Others exchanged horrified looks. My mother sat frozen, so her pearls clutched tightly. Her lips stretched into a brittle smile. Samantha, though, was glowing. She leaned back in her chair, chin high, lips curled into the smirk I had known since childhood. Triumph gleamed in her eyes, as though she had orchestrated the entire scene. My father wasn't finished, his face twisted with contempt. "My daughter is pathetic. She is nothing like her sister, who makes me proud every day. To stand here and watch this farce is the greatest humiliation of my life." A sharp intake of breath rippled through the guests. Some lowered their eyes in discomfort. Others leaned in, eager for more spectacle. My heart pounded against my ribs, my throat closing. My bouquet trembled, petals scattering under my grip. For a moment, I thought I might faint, collapse in front of 200 strangers. My father's words echoing as the final verdict on who I was. The officiant shifted uneasily, clearly at a loss. A band member coughed in the corner, the sound echoing too loudly. The weight of judgment pressed on me from all sides. My skin burned, my breath came shallow, and all I could think was how familiar this felt. This was every dinner table where I was mocked, every holiday where my choices were belittled, every time Samantha was praised while I was reduced to a cautionary tale. But this time, it wasn't behind closed doors. It was under chandeliers, in front of strangers who would carry the story back into their worlds. I wanted to vanish, to disappear into the polished floorboards. Shame roared so loudly in my ears, I barely noticed when Michael's hand slid into mine. But the moment his fingers tightened, everything stilled. He squeezed, hard, steady, and sure, the warmth of his hand cutting through my trembling. I turned, expecting pity in his eyes, but found none. Instead, I saw calm certainty, something resolute, as if he had been waiting for this moment. His jaw was set, his gaze unwavering. He leaned close, his breath brushing my ear, his voice low but firm. It's time they knew. The words jolted me. Knew what my father's insults still echoed. The guests' whispers still churned, but something in Michael's tone carved through the chaos. He straightened his grip, still locked with mine, and looked out over the ballroom. The shift in him was immediate. No longer the quiet waiter, no longer the man content to fade into the background. His presence expanded, commanding the silence as if the chandeliers themselves had dimmed to spotlight him. The guests seemed to sense it too. The whispers faltered, the murmurs died down. Samantha's smirk flickered a crack, breaking through her mask. Even my father leaned forward slightly, his scotch hovering in midair, as though he had suddenly realized the ground beneath him was less solid than he thought. My humiliation hadn't vanished, but it twisted into something else: anticipation. Something was about to happen, something no one in that room expected. I clutched Michael's hand tighter, my heart hammering. As he stepped toward the microphone, the silence deepened, the kind that comes before a storm, and I knew without question that nothing in my life or in my family's carefully constructed world would ever be the same after the words he was about to say. The reception hall buzzed with uncomfortable energy after Dad's devastating speech. I sat frozen at the head table, my wedding dress feeling like a costume in some cruel play. I never auditioned. 4. The humiliation burned through me like acid, and I couldn't bring myself to look at the hundreds of guests who had witnessed my father's public character assassination. Michael's hand found mine under the table, warm and steady. For a moment, I thought he might pull me away from this nightmare, whisk me out of the Fairmont Copley Plaza and into some quiet corner where I could fall apart in private. But instead, he stood up. The entire ballroom fell silent. Every conversation died mid-sentence as my new husband rose to his full height, commanding attention without saying a word. The crystal chandeliers cast golden light across his face, and for the first time since I'd known him, he looked different, confident in a way that went beyond the quiet assurance I'd grown to love. This was power, real power, settling across his shoulders like a mantle. "Ladies and gentlemen," Michael began, his voice carrying easily through the massive room without amplification. "I believe there's been a misunderstanding tonight, and I think it's time to clear the air." My stomach dropped. What was he doing? The last thing I needed was more attention, more scrutiny. I tugged gently on his hand, but he gave me a reassuring squeeze and continued. "My name is Michael Taylor," he said, and my heart skipped. "Taylor. I'm the CEO of Taylor Hospitality Group. We own Lumiere, where Jessica and I first met. We also own this hotel, the Fairmont Copley Plaza, along with 47 other properties across the Northeast." The silence stretched impossibly long. Then, like dominoes falling, recognition rippled through the crowd. Murmurs started at the business tables near the front and spread backward. Through the room, I watched faces change as people processed what they'd just heard. The Taylor name carried weight in Boston business circles, serious weight. "I chose to work as a server at Lumiere for the past 2 years. Michael continued, his eyes finding mine briefly before scanning the crowd. "I wanted to understand our business from the ground up, but more importantly, I wanted to meet someone who would love me for who I am, not what I own." The murmurs grew louder. Someone near the back actually gasped. At the business tables, several men in expensive suits were leaning forward, suddenly very interested. I recognized James Reynolds from the Chronicle Herald, who'd been covering Boston's restaurant scene for decades. He was practically vibrating with excitement. "Jessica fell in love with a waiter," Michael said, his voice warming as he looked down at me. "Someone she thought worked for tips and lived paycheck to paycheck. She chose me anyway. She defended me to her family, stood by me when it would have been easier to find someone more suitable to their standards." My eyes filled with tears, but for the first time tonight, they weren't from shame. The way he was looking at me, the pride in his voice when he talked about my choice, it was everything I'd never gotten from my own family. "That, ladies and gentlemen, is the woman I married tonight. Someone who judges people by their character, not their bank account. Someone who chose love over status, authenticity over appearances." Applause started somewhere in the middle of the room and spread like wildfire. People were standing now, clapping and cheering. James Reynolds was on his feet, applauding enthusiastically. Several other business leaders I didn't recognize were nodding approvingly, some raising their champagne glasses in salute. I turned to look at my family's table. Dad sat like he'd been turned to stone, his face completely drained of color. Mom's mouth hung open, her perfectly applied lipstick suddenly making her look like a shocked porcelain doll. And Sam, my golden child sister, stared at Michael with an expression I'd never seen before. Pure, undiluted shock mixed with something that might have been fear. The applause died down as Dad slowly, awkwardly got to his feet. His politician's instincts were kicking in, that automatic smile sliding into place even as his eyes remained wide with disbelief. He made his way over to our table, his hand already extending for a congratulatory handshake. Mr. Taylor. Dad stammered, his voice lacking its usual commanding tone. What a wonderful surprise. I had no idea. We should talk about potential partnerships, maybe over lunch next week. Michael looked at the offered hand for a long moment. The entire room seemed to hold its breath. Then, with the same gentle politeness I'd seen him use with difficult customers at Lumiere, he declined. I appreciate the offer, Mr. Mitchell, but I don't build business relationships based on money or social status, Michael said. His tone was respectful but firm, carrying none of the deference Dad was used to receiving. The way you spoke about your daughter tonight, the woman I love more than anything in this world, tells me everything I need to know about your values. Dad's face flushed red, then pale again. Around us, the crowd was listening to every word, and I could see some people pulling out phones to record. This was going to be all over Boston's social media before we cut the cake. Michael turned slightly, addressing the room as much as my father. You were wrong tonight, sir. Dead wrong. True worth isn't measured in job titles or bank balances or family names. It's measured in character, in kindness, in the courage to choose what's right over what's easy. He paused, letting that sink in before continuing. Jessica could have married any number of men from your social circle, men with the right pedigree, the right connections, the right investment portfolios. Instead, she chose someone she thought was a waiter because she saw something in him that mattered more than money. That makes her remarkable, not pathetic. The room erupted again, this time with even more enthusiasm. People were cheering, whistling, calling out things like, "Well said," and "About time." I felt like I was watching a movie where the underdog finally gets their moment of triumph. Except somehow I was the underdog, and this was really happening. Dad stood there for another moment, his hands still extended, looking smaller than I'd ever seen him. Finally, he let it drop to his side and walked back to his table without another word. Mom followed her heels, clicking sharply against the marble floor. Sam remained frozen in her chair, staring at us with something that looked almost like respect for the first time in our lives. Michael sat back down and took my hand again. Are you okay? He whispered, his confident public persona melting back into the gentleman I'd fallen in love with. I nodded, not trusting my voice yet. Around us, the party was transforming. People who had been whispering and staring were now approaching our table with genuine congratulations. Business cards appeared from nowhere as Boston's elite suddenly wanted to know more about the mysterious CEO who'd been hiding in plain sight. But all I could focus on was Michael's face. The way he'd just taken on my entire family and won without raising his voice or losing his dignity. He'd given me something I'd been searching for my whole life without even knowing it. He'd given me vindication. 6 months after our wedding, I stood in our penthouse kitchen, watching the sunrise paint Boston Harbor in shades of gold and pink. The view from the 42nd floor never got old. But what I treasured most was the quiet contentment that had settled into my life. Michael emerged from the bedroom, already dressed in one of his perfectly tailored suits, but he paused to wrap his arms around me from behind. Ready for another day with your kindergarteners, he murmured against my hair. I leaned back into his warmth. Always, Mrs. Peterson's class is reading at a 3rd grade level now. I'm so proud of them. He squeezed me tighter. I'm proud of you. You know that, right? Those words still meant everything to me. After 29 years of being told I was a disappointment, hearing genuine pride in someone's voice felt like a miracle I'd never stop appreciating. The past 6 months hadn't been without their challenges. Dad had called 3 times the week after our wedding, each conversation growing more desperate as he realized Michael wasn't some social climber he could manipulate or dismiss. The first call had been stiff and formal, a clear attempt to smooth things over for business purposes. Jessica, perhaps we could all have dinner at the club. I'm sure Michael would enjoy meeting some of our associates. I declined politely but firmly. The second call came 2 weeks later, with Dad actually using the word sorry for the first time in my memory, though he'd managed to make it sound more like a negotiation than an apology. I'm sorry if my speech seemed harsh. You know how I get when I'm protecting the family reputation. Michael seems like a fine young man. The third call had been the most honest and the most heartbreaking. Dad's voice had cracked slightly when he'd admitted, "I may have been wrong about some things, Jessica. I'd like to try to fix this." But some things couldn't be fixed with a phone call. Not after a lifetime of being made to feel small. Not after he'd humiliated me at my own wedding. I'd told him I needed time and he'd respected that, though I knew it killed his controlling nature to wait for someone else's timeline. Mom had taken a different approach, showing up at my school one afternoon with an expensive floral arrangement and tears in her eyes. She'd actually used the word proud when talking about my teaching, though I could tell it took effort for her to see past her social conditioning. "I never understood why you chose this," she'd said, gesturing around my colorful classroom. "But seeing you with those children, how much they love you, I'm beginning to realize there are different ways to make a difference in the world." It was progress slow and imperfect, but progress nonetheless. Michael had been incredible through all of it. When Dad had approached him at a charity gala 2 months after our wedding, trying once again to discuss business opportunities, Michael had been polite but clear. "Mr. Mitchell, I appreciate your interest, but I make business decisions based on merit and mutual respect, not family connections. Right now, I don't feel we share enough common values to build a successful partnership." A dad had walked away looking like he'd been slapped, and I'd felt a satisfaction that probably wasn't very charitable but was deeply satisfying nonetheless. The biggest surprise had come from Sam. 3 months after the wedding, she'd called me, her voice smaller than I'd ever heard it. "Jess, can we talk? I mean, really talk?" We'd met at a quiet cafe in Cambridge, and for the first time in our lives, we'd had an honest conversation. Sam had looked tired, older somehow, her usual polished perfection cracked around the edges. "I've been thinking a lot about what Michael said at your wedding." She'd begun stirring her coffee nervously, "about character mattering more than status. I realized I don't know who I am without Dad's approval, without the family name, without all the things I thought made me special." She'd paused, tears gathering in her eyes. "You were brave, Jess. You were always the brave one, and I was too jealous to see it." 6 months later, Sam had quit her job at Mitchell Capital, much to Dad's horror. She'd enrolled in an interior design program at Boston University, something she'd apparently dreamed about since college, but never had the courage to pursue. And just last month, she'd started dating David Torres, a kindergarten teacher she'd met when he'd come to speak at one of her design classes about creating child-friendly spaces. The irony wasn't lost on any of us. The golden child was now dating someone with the same profession her family had mocked me for choosing. "He's wonderful, Jess," Sam had told me over lunch last week, her face glowing in a way I'd never seen before. "He doesn't care about my trust fund or my family connections. He just likes that I make him laugh and that I'm passionate about creating beautiful spaces for kids." Watching Sam discover who she really was beneath all the expectations and pressure had been almost as healing as finding my own happiness. She was finally becoming a person I actually enjoyed being around, someone genuine and kind instead of performatively perfect. Michael walked me to school every morning when his schedule allowed, a habit that had started during our dating days and continued into married life. Today, as we walked through I marveled at how different my life looked compared to a year ago. "Penny for your thoughts," Michael said, noticing my reflective mood. "Just thinking about how strange life is," I said, adjusting my teacher bag on my shoulder. A year ago, I was the family disappointment. Now, Sam's following a path similar to mine. Dad's trying to figure out how to relate to me as an adult, and I'm married to someone who thinks my kindergarten stories are the highlight of his day. Michael laughed, the sound warming me better than any expensive coat could. "Your kindergarten stories are the highlight of my day. Yesterday's tale about Tommy thinking crayons were vegetables was comedy gold." As we reached Lincoln Elementary, Michael kissed me goodbye like he did every morning, ignoring the curious looks from other teachers and parents who still couldn't quite believe that the CEO of Taylor Hospitality Group was married to a kindergarten teacher. But that was their problem, not ours. "Have a good day, Mrs. Taylor," he said with a grin. "You too, Mr. Taylor." Standing in my classroom doorway, watching him walk away, I felt overwhelmed by gratitude. Not just for Michael, though he was wonderful, but for the entire journey that had brought me here. Every harsh word from Dad, every dismissive comment from Mom, every snide remark from Sam had been necessary to bring me to this moment of complete contentment with who I was. The little girl who'd been called pathetic at her own wedding was gone. In her place stood a woman who knew her worth, who'd found love that celebrated rather than tolerated her choices, and who'd discovered that sometimes the best revenge against people who underestimate you is simply living your truth with joy. My students started filtering in 20 bright faces ready to learn and grow, and I smiled as I prepared to start another day doing exactly what I was meant to do. If you've ever been told you're not enough, that your dreams are too small, or that you should settle for someone else's version of success, I want you to know something. Your worth isn't determined by other people's opinions, even when those people are your family. True value comes from character kindness and the courage to choose authenticity over approval. I'd love to hear your story. Have you ever been underestimated or dismissed? Only to prove everyone wrong, share your experience in the comments below. Sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is remind each other that we're not alone in our struggles and that happy endings are possible, even when they look different than we originally imagined. 2 years later, I stood in the nursery of our penthouse, painting the walls a soft sage green while Michael assembled a crib nearby. The afternoon sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting golden light across Boston Harbor. Our daughter would arrive in 3 months, and I couldn't wait to meet her. "What do you think about the name Emma?" Michael asked, looking up from the instruction manual with that same gentle smile that had first captured my heart at Lumiere. "Perfect," I said, resting my hand on my growing belly. "Emma Taylor has a nice ring to it." My phone buzzed with a text from Sam. She'd just gotten engaged to David, and her message included a photo of her simple but elegant ring alongside the words following in my big sister's footsteps. "Thank you for showing me what real love looks like." Dad had finally stopped trying to force business meetings and started asking about baby names instead. Mom brought homemade soup to our apartment last week, staying for tea and actually listening when I talked about my students. The healing was slow, imperfect, but real. Michael wrapped his arms around me from behind, his hands covering mine on my stomach. "Any regrets about marrying a waiter?" he teased. I laughed, leaning back into his warmth. "None, though I do miss your excellent table service." "I can still bring you breakfast in bed, Mrs. Taylor." Outside our window, the harbor sparkled in the late afternoon light. Somewhere across the city, my kindergartners were probably having dinner with their families, and tomorrow I'd get to see their bright faces again. Life had become beautifully ordinary, filled with the kind of happiness that didn't need an audience or approval. Sometimes the greatest victory isn't proving others wrong. It's simply